Do you think the internet makes people kinder or crueler? Most of us scroll to relax. We watch funny clips, cute animals, especially cats. But what if I told you, there are people who don't watch cats for comfort. They watch them suffer, and they pay for it. Stay till the end of this story, because what you're about to hear isn't just disturbing. It's happening right now. The internet is full of soft, comforting things. When life feels heavy, people turn to videos of playful kittens, sleepy cats curled into blankets, or funny moments where pets act like humans. For many, these clips are harmless escapes from stress. Cats, in particular, have become symbols of warmth and innocence online. But behind that bright surface, something much darker exists. Most people don't realize that not every cat video is made for joy. In hidden corners of the internet, entire communities exist for a completely different purpose. These groups are not there to laugh or relax. They are there to watch suffering. And worse, to request it. This story isn't about one bad person. It's about a system that allowed cruelty to grow in silence. It involves thousands of animals, years of abuse, and people who treated pain like entertainment. It began when volunteers and animal activists noticed strange content spreading in encrypted online groups. The videos were not shared publicly. They were hidden behind private links and paid access. People weren't stumbling onto them by accident. They were searching for them. Inside these groups, cats weren't seen as living beings. They were treated like objects. Requests were made. Bets were placed. Viewers paid money to decide what would happen next. The more extreme the suffering, the more attention it received. One of the most shocking discoveries was that this wasn't random. It was organized. There were schedules. There were regular uploads. There were customers from different countries. What began as cruelty slowly became business. Even more disturbing was how the animals were obtained. Many came from streets where no one would notice their disappearance. Others were taken through false promises of adoption. A system meant to protect animals became the tool used to destroy them. And while this happened, most people remained unaware. Social media showed us dancing cats and playful kittens, while in the shadows, suffering was being recorded and sold. Authorities often looked away. Platforms removed posts but not the networks behind them. The cruelty continued because it could hide. By the time the truth started to spread, the numbers were already staggering. Not dozens. Not hundreds. Thousands. These were not accidents. They were planned. And people paid to watch. But the most terrifying part of this story isn't what happened to the cats. It's who was responsible. Because when investigators finally traced one of the main figures behind these videos, they found someone no one would ever suspect. In part 2, I'll tell you how an ordinary, respected professional was exposed, and what he had been hiding for years. When investigators finally traced the source of one of the largest torture networks, they expected to find someone hiding in the shadows, unemployed, unstable, or already known to authorities. Instead, they found a man who looked perfectly normal. He was in his late 20s, well-dressed, educated, and working a respected job in a major city. On the surface, he appeared disciplined and successful. The kind of person neighbors would trust. The kind of person parents would want their children to become. But online, he lived another life. Under a false name, he had been uploading cruelty for years. Not once or twice. Consistently. What began as isolated videos slowly turned into a steady stream of content. Over time, he built a reputation in private groups where users paid to watch animals suffer. Psychologists who study behavior like this describe a pattern. These individuals don't see animals as living beings. They see them as tools. Objects for control. Objects for release. The suffering itself becomes the reward. What made this case worse was how long it went unnoticed. 4 years, he moved between two worlds. A public life that looked clean and respectable, and a private life fueled by cruelty. The animals came from places no one would question. Some were taken from the streets. Others were obtained by pretending to adopt them. He used kindness as camouflage. A fake smile. A fake promise of safety. Once inside his apartment, the truth emerged. Each video followed a routine. Photos were posted beforehand. Group members sent in requests. They voted. They paid. Then they waited for the next upload. The network didn't just watch. They participated. Members treated it like a game. They competed for attention by suggesting more extreme ideas. The worse the outcome, the more praise was given. It wasn't just cruelty, it was community. Money flowed through the system. Small payments at first. Then larger ones. International users joined. The cruelty crossed borders. What started as twisted curiosity became business. When activists finally uncovered his identity and confronted his family, they expected answers. Instead, they were met with rage. Doors slammed. Phones smashed. Threats shouted. The man himself refused to speak. Authorities arrived, but nothing changed. He claimed the evidence was gone. The videos were stored on overseas platforms. The devices had disappeared. Without proof in hand, nothing could be done. The case stalled. And within days, posts exposing him vanished from local platforms. Censored. Removed. Forgotten. But this man was not the only one. He was just one face among many. Because while one network was exposed, dozens more continued operating quietly. But here's the question no one wanted to answer. Why wasn't this treated as a serious crime? In Part 3, I'll explain how legal loopholes protected the abusers, and why in some places, hurting stray animals isn't even considered illegal. When people heard what had been happening, many assumed the same thing. There must be laws against this. But in reality, the legal system had a dangerous blind spot. In several places, animals are not recognized as beings with rights. They are classified as property. That means if someone harms a pet, the issue is treated like damaged furniture or a broken phone. The crime isn't cruelty, it's loss of property value. And when it comes to stray animals, they belong to no one. Which means, under existing laws, hurting them often isn't considered a crime at all. This loophole created a safe space for abuse. The networks knew it. They studied it. They built their systems around it. They chose animals that could not be traced back to owners. They avoided locations with strict regulations. They stored content on foreign platforms beyond easy reach of local authorities. Even when activists collected names, group titles, and descriptions of what was being shared, it rarely led to action. Officers said they needed physical proof. Devices. Files. Local servers. But the evidence lived behind encrypted apps and overseas servers. So while posts exposing abusers were quickly removed or hidden, the networks themselves stayed alive. Platforms also played a role. Public social media removed clips when users reported them, but the groups simply moved elsewhere. Private channels. Locked communities. Paid access. Every shutdown led to a new name and a new group. It became a cycle. Expose, remove, rebuild. And the people responsible learned to stay one step ahead. Some volunteers tried to push for legal reform. Draft laws were proposed that would introduce real punishment for animal cruelty. Jail time, heavy fines, criminal records. But progress was slow. Political focus went elsewhere. Other issues took priority. The suffering of stray animals didn't carry enough weight. Without pressure from the public, the proposals stalled. Meanwhile, the networks grew. As long as there was demand, there was supply. And as long as there was no risk, there was no reason to stop. In countries with strong animal protection laws, similar content is treated like violent crime. Accounts are tracked. Offenders are registered. Platforms are legally required to cooperate. The abuse doesn't vanish, but it becomes harder to hide. Here, it stayed in the open shadows. Protected by silence. Protected by indifference. Protected by law. And this raised a question that frightened experts. If someone enjoys watching suffering, and nothing stops them, what happens when animals are no longer enough? Because what started as cruelty to animals didn't stay small. In Part 4, I'll show you how these communities turned torture into competition, and how viewers didn't just watch, they controlled what happened next. By the time investigators began entering these hidden groups, the cruelty had evolved into something more structured and far more disturbing. This wasn't random violence anymore. It was interactive. Inside the private channels, members didn't just sit and watch. They took part. They made suggestions. They voted. They paid. Before each recording, photos of the cats were shared. The animals were still alive, still unaware of what was coming. Group members reacted with emojis and comments, not sympathy. They treated the situation like a menu. Try this. Make it last longer. Do it differently this time. The more shocking the idea, the more attention it got. Over time, a twisted culture formed inside these spaces. New members learned quickly what earned respect: cruelty. If someone proposed a method that stood out, they were praised. If someone hesitated, they were mocked. Empathy was treated as weakness. What made this even worse was the money. Access to these groups wasn't free. Members paid entry fees. They paid for custom requests. They paid for priority viewing. Some sent tips to encourage more content. It created a system where pain was rewarded financially. And the audience wasn't small. Members came from different countries, different age groups, and different backgrounds. Some were teenagers hiding behind fake names. Others were middle-aged professionals logging in after work. Some claimed it was curiosity. Others admitted it was addiction. Experts who study this behavior say the structure itself matters. When cruelty becomes shared, it becomes normalized. Watching it with others turns it into social behavior instead of personal shame. The group gives permission. Worse, the cruelty escalated. What once shocked them stopped being enough. They needed something stronger. Something more extreme. Something that proved they still felt something. And so the requests became more intense. The administrators understood their audience well. They posted previews. They built anticipation. They counted down to releases. It was marketed like a show. Meanwhile, the cats were invisible as victims. They were not described as living beings. They were referred to as items, units, content. Language removed responsibility. This wasn't about animals anymore. It was about control, about dominance, about power over something that could not resist. And the scariest part? Many of these users didn't think they were doing anything wrong. In their minds, they weren't hurting anyone. They weren't touching the animals. They were just watching, just paying, just participating. But every click kept the system alive. Every payment created demand. Every comment pushed the next act further. And slowly, this underground world grew louder. But eventually, someone inside these groups broke the silence. In part 5, I'll tell you about the volunteers who went undercover, and what it cost them to witness this world from the inside. Stopping these groups required something most people couldn't handle. Someone had to go inside them. Animal welfare volunteers knew that screenshots and rumors weren't enough. If they wanted platforms and authorities to take action, they needed proof. So a few of them did what no one wanted to do. They joined the groups themselves. Using fake names and encrypted accounts, they paid the entry fees and blended in. They watched how the communities operated. They saved messages. They documented usernames, payment patterns, and group structures. What they found was worse than expected. These weren't chaotic spaces. They were organized. Admins enforced rules. Members followed schedules. Content was labeled and archived. The cruelty had order. One volunteer described it as stepping into another reality. In public, the world was full of animal lovers and rescue videos. Inside these groups, suffering was celebrated. Messages congratulated each other for creativity. Laughing reactions replaced sympathy. The emotional cost was enormous. Volunteers said they often closed their laptops shaking. Some cried afterward. Some couldn't sleep. Others felt sick knowing they had to pretend to enjoy what they were seeing just to stay inside. But staying inside was the only way to collect enough information to shut the groups down. They passed what they found to journalists, tech companies, and international organizations. Slowly, attention grew. Accounts were flagged. Channels were reported. Some groups vanished overnight. But every shutdown had a consequence. New groups appeared under new names. Old members regrouped. Different platforms were used. It was like cutting weeds without pulling out the roots. What disturbed volunteers most wasn't just the cruelty. It was the age range of the members. Some sounded like children. Others sounded like grandparents. The internet had erased distance and shame. One undercover volunteer said the hardest moment was realizing how normal these people seemed. They talked about work, school, and daily life, and then switched back to discussing torture like it was a hobby. This made one truth painfully clear. These weren't monsters hiding in basements. They were ordinary people hiding behind screens. And the volunteers began asking the same question psychologists were asking. If someone learns to enjoy watching pain, what happens when that isn't enough anymore? Research shows a pattern. Cruelty often grows. What once shocks becomes boring. The need for stronger stimulation appears. And sometimes, animals are only the beginning. That fear is what kept the volunteers going. They knew they couldn't save every animal. But every group exposed meant fewer victims. Every video removed meant one less incentive to continue. They were fighting not just for animals, but against what this behavior could become. And while volunteers fought online, something unexpected happened in the real world. In part 6, I'll tell you about the moment one abuser was confronted in public, and how the crowd decided to become the punishment. Not every case ended with silence. In one situation, an abuser was identified before authorities could act. His name spread through animal welfare circles and online forums. Volunteers discovered he was planning to adopt another kitten using a fake story about giving it a safe home. They decided not to wait. Word spread quickly, and several people showed up at the public place where the adoption was supposed to happen. When the man arrived, he found himself surrounded. Phones were recording. Voices were raised. Strangers confronted him with evidence of what he had done. At first, he denied everything. Then someone played part of a recording. His face changed. What happened next shocked the entire country. Instead of being arrested on the spot, he was dragged away from the crowd into a quieter area. People demanded he confess. They forced him to say what he had done. Some hit him. Others shouted. The scene lasted for hours. By morning, he was bruised and bleeding. Videos of the confrontation spread fast. Many celebrated it as justice. Others were horrified by the violence. But everyone noticed the same thing. This only happened because the system failed. There was no legal punishment waiting for him. No guaranteed arrest. No serious charge. So people took matters into their own hands. Police later said they would investigate, but the focus shifted. Instead of the animals, the discussion became about the assault on the man. His injuries mattered more than the animals he had harmed. And this wasn't an isolated incident. In other cities, similar patterns appeared. Abusers were exposed online. Employers fired them. Universities removed them. But criminal charges were rare. Most consequences were social, not legal. Some lost jobs. Some disappeared from the internet. Some simply started over under new names. And the cruelty continued. One security guard was filmed harming a stray animal and lost his job. That was it. Another case involved someone from a wealthy family. No charges were filed. In another, a man was briefly detained and released after a public apology. Again and again, the same message was sent. Hurting animals carries little risk. This created a dangerous imbalance. On one side, abusers felt protected. On the other, citizens felt powerless. And when people feel powerless, they sometimes turn to anger. The confrontations weren't about revenge. They were about desperation. About trying to stop something when no authority would. But violence didn't solve the problem. It only proved how broken the response had become. Because while one man was being punished by strangers, hundreds of others were still uploading content quietly. And the numbers were growing. By the next year, the scale of this cruelty became impossible to ignore. In Part 7, I'll reveal how often new videos were appearing, and why experts warned this wasn't just about animals anymore. By the time researchers began tracking these networks closely, the scale of what was happening became clear, and it was accelerating. Animal rights groups started counting how often new content appeared. At first, it was every few days. Then every day. Eventually, it became multiple times a day. What shocked them wasn't just the volume, but the speed. As soon as one video disappeared, another took its place. This wasn't chaos. It was momentum. Analysts noticed something disturbing. The behavior inside these groups followed a pattern similar to other forms of online extremism. Members didn't start with the most violent content. They worked their way up. Mild curiosity turned into repeated exposure. Repeated exposure turned into tolerance. And tolerance turned into escalation. Psychologists describe this as desensitization. The brain adapts. Shock fades. And the need for stronger stimulation grows. Some members admitted this themselves. They said the first videos made them uncomfortable. After a while, they needed something new. Something different. Something stronger. The cruelty had to keep increasing just to hold their attention. Experts warn that this doesn't stay contained. Studies of violent offenders have shown a troubling link between animal cruelty and later aggression toward people. It's not guaranteed, but it appears often enough to matter. The enjoyment of control. The excitement of suffering. The lack of empathy. These traits don't vanish on their own. And yet, the system still treated it as a low priority. Laws focused on property. Platforms focused on public image. Enforcement focused on political speech and financial crimes. Meanwhile, the networks adapted. They changed names. They changed platforms. They used codes and symbols. They hid behind layers of anonymity. When international media finally reported on the issue, the reaction was immediate. Channels were removed. Accounts were shut down. Protests appeared in multiple cities around the world. For a brief moment, it looked like something might change. But pressure fades. And without long-term action, attention moves on. The groups didn't disappear. They just became quieter. Volunteers say this is the hardest part. Every time awareness rises, there is a short pause. Then the content returns. New users join. Old users come back. The cycle continues. What began as hidden cruelty had grown into a machine driven by demand. A market built on suffering. A community trained to ignore pain. And the animals remained the easiest targets. They couldn't speak. They couldn't escape. They couldn't report what was happening. Which left one final question hanging over everything. If a society allows this to exist, what does it say about what it will tolerate next? This story doesn't end with arrests or justice. In Part 8, I'll tell you what actually slows this cruelty down, and why public pressure may be the only weapon left. There is no clean ending to this story. No courtroom scene where justice finally wins. No single arrest that shuts everything down. No moment where the cruelty simply stops. What actually slows it is something much less dramatic and much more fragile. Attention. When these networks stay hidden, they grow. When they are dragged into the light, they shrink. Platforms remove content faster. Payment routes become harder to use. Groups are forced to rebuild again and again. It doesn't erase the cruelty, but it makes it harder to organize and harder to profit from. This is why journalists, volunteers, and activists keep exposing what they find, even when it costs them sleep, mental health, and sometimes safety. They know one uncomfortable truth. Silence protects abusers more than laws ever could. International pressure has proven this. When large media outlets report on these cases, platforms respond. Channels vanish overnight. Sponsors pull away. Governments that once ignored the issue suddenly feel watched. In some cases, policies change. Not because of compassion, but because of embarrassment. Shame, it turns out, works faster than justice. In countries with stronger animal protection laws, the same behavior leads to prison time. Offenders are tracked. Content is treated like violent material, not entertainment. The networks still exist, but they are smaller, quieter, and riskier to run. That shows something important. This cruelty isn't unstoppable. It isn't inevitable. It isn't natural. It survives because it is allowed to. And the people who create this content rely on one thing above all else: anonymity. They believe they will never be seen, never be named, never be held responsible. That belief is their shield, which means awareness is the crack in that shield. Every report makes it harder to hide. Every exposed group forces a restart. Every removed video breaks the reward cycle. You don't have to be an activist. You don't have to go undercover. You don't even have to love cats. But when you see cruelty, don't scroll past it. When you see abuse, report it. When you see silence, don't join it. Because these animals have no way to speak for themselves. They can't leave comments. They can't file complaints. They can't warn others. All they have is visibility. And history shows that when people finally look, systems are forced to move. This story is disturbing because of what happened to the animals. But it's also disturbing because of what it reveals about us. What we tolerate, what we ignore, and what we choose to stop. So the real question isn't, how could this happen? It's, what will we allow to happen next? If you made it this far, share this story. Because the only thing stronger than cruelty in the dark is exposure in the light.